On the morning of August 8, 1918, the most powerful German general in the world sat down at his desk and read a single report. His name was Erich Ludendorff. He had spent 4 years building an army that was supposed to be unbreakable. The report told him it was broken. In 6 hours, the Canadian Corps had torn an 8-kilometer hole through his lines. Thousands of his soldiers had been captured, and the Canadians were still moving forward. Ludendorff later wrote that August 8th was the black day of the German army in the history of the war. Not the day the Americans arrived, not the day the tanks first appeared at the Somme, this specific morning. What Ludendorff did not write was the name of anyone who had actually been there. So here is one: Private Thomas Hillier, 22 years old, hardware store clerk from Guelph, Ontario. He had mud in his boots and a letter from his mother in his pocket. He climbed out of a trench at 4:20 in the morning into a fog so thick he could not see the man 2 steps ahead of him, and he helped end a world war before breakfast. Thomas had been in France for 14 months. In that time, he had learned 3 things. The coffee was always cold. Officers lied, not out of cruelty, but because truth was a luxury that trenches could not afford. And when something went wrong, it was always the men at the bottom who felt it first and felt it longest. He was not a man built for history. He had come to France because his friend David had enlisted, and dying next to someone you knew seemed, at 19, slightly less terrifying than dying alone. David had been killed at Passchendaele 11 months earlier. Thomas had kept going the way men keep going when the alternative is to stop, without thinking about it too carefully. By August of 1918, he had stopped flinching at incoming fire. This was not bravery. It was exhaustion so complete it had reorganized something in his body permanently. Nobody had told Thomas what was coming on the night of August 7th. That was deliberate. That was the most important tactical decision in the entire battle. It had been made by a man Thomas had never met, General Arthur Currie. Currie was not the kind of general who made speeches. He was a former real estate agent from Victoria who had failed spectacularly in business, borrowed regimental funds to cover his personal debts, and somehow built the Canadian Corps into the most feared fighting force on the Western Front. He was heavy, he was humorless, and he was right about almost everything. What Currie understood was that the Germans were not afraid of the Allies in general. They were afraid of the Canadians specifically. After Vimy Ridge, after Hill 70, after every battle where the Canadians had taken the objective that everyone else had failed to reach, German intelligence had standing orders: find the Canadians. Where they appear, the attack follows. So Currie sent 2 Canadian divisions north to Ypres in late July with full radio traffic and maximum visibility. German intelligence found them immediately and began shifting reserves north. Then the 2 divisions turned around. They moved back to Amiens in complete darkness under strict radio silence. Aircraft flew low over the roads to drown out the sound of engines. They arrived without a single German soldier knowing they were there. It was the largest successful deception on the Western Front. Thomas knew none of this. He knew only that 3 nights ago his unit had been moved in the dark and told nothing. He knew that the volume of ammunition on the supply roads was so large the horses were stumbling. And he knew that Corporal Baines, who had been in France since 1915, and who could read battles the way farmers read weather, had cleaned his rifle in silence and said only one thing: something is coming, something big. At 4:19 in the morning on August 8th, the world was completely silent. Not the ordinary silence of a quiet night. The silence before a barrage has a texture that men who have experienced it never forget and never adequately describe. It is the silence of 430 tanks holding position in the dark. It is the silence of nearly 2,000 artillery guns with their crews standing ready. It is the silence of 100,000 men who have been told to wait and who are waiting. Thomas noticed that the new men in his section were not speaking. One of them was praying. His lips were moving without sound. Thomas did not pray. He checked his rifle for the fourth time. He looked at the fog, and he thought about nothing at all, which was the only useful thing a man could do in the 60 seconds before everything changed. At 4:20, the guns opened. The sound was not what Thomas expected, and he had expected a great deal because he had been in barrages before. This was not a barrage. This was a single convulsive detonation that seemed to come from inside the earth itself, a sound so total and so simultaneous that his vision went white for half a second before his training took over. He was over the parapet before the second volley landed. The fog was so dense he navigated by sound and by the bulk of the tank moving ahead of him. He crossed the no man's land he had stared at for 3 weeks. He reached the German first line in less than 4 minutes. What he found there was not resistance, it was collapse. Men standing with their hands raised, some still holding food, some without boots, all of them wearing the expression of soldiers who had been functional 30 seconds ago and who were now processing the information that everything they had been told was wrong. Thomas moved through them without stopping because the orders were not to stop. The orders were to keep moving past the point where every previous offensive had stalled, to push until the German ability to reorganize was gone. He kept moving. The Canadian Corps kept moving. By noon, they had advanced 8 kilometers. By the end of the day, 13. 13 kilometers in a single day. In 4 years of a war that had consumed millions of lives for gains measured in meters, 13 kilometers was not a statistic. It was a verdict. Ludendorff received the final reports that evening and wrote that the war must be ended. Not that the battle had been difficult, not that reinforcements were needed, that the war must be ended. Thomas did not know this. He was sitting in a shell crater east of Amiens, eating a biscuit and checking whether the pain in his shoulder was shrapnel or the weight of his kit. It was the kit. Corporal Baines appeared at the edge of the crater and looked at the German prisoners walking to the rear in columns so long they disappeared into the smoke. Baines said one word, "Well." Thomas looked at the same columns. "Something big," Thomas said. Baines said nothing else. He climbed down into the crater, and they sat together in the noise and the smoke of a day that had just changed the direction of the entire war. Neither of them said another word, because there were no words adequate to what they had just walked through, and because in the morning there would be another order to move, and the only thing that mattered now was being ready for it. There is a moment in every battle when the men fighting it understand, before any general does, before any report is written or any map is updated, that something fundamental has shifted. It arrives not as information, but as a physical sensation. Thomas felt it on the morning of August 9th, when a German soldier came out of a shell crater with his hands raised and his face carrying an expression Thomas had never seen on an enemy before. Not defiance, not fear, something closer to relief, as if being captured was the best thing that had happened to him in months. Thomas stared at that face for 2 full seconds, which was 1 second longer than he could afford, and then pointed the man toward the rear and kept walking. He would see that expression hundreds of times over the next 90 days. He just did not understand it yet. Understanding it would come later, at a cost he had not budgeted for. The day before had ended with 13 kilometers of captured ground and columns of German prisoners so long they disappeared into the smoke. Thomas had eaten a biscuit in a shell crater and said nothing because there was nothing adequate to say. But August 9th was different. The Germans had spent the night rushing reserves toward the hole the Canadians had torn in their lines. By morning, the resistance was already thickening. The clean momentum of the first day was gone. In its place was the grinding, familiar friction of an enemy that had absorbed the shock and was beginning to push back.
Curry did not pause. He understood something about momentum that is easy to state and nearly impossible to act on in the middle of a battle. A bent enemy and a broken enemy look identical from a distance. The difference between them is the 24 hours in which you either keep pressing or give them time to straighten. Curry kept pressing, and Thomas kept pressing with him because the man next to him was moving forward, and stopping while the man next to you kept going was a kind of death that had nothing to do with bullets. The man next to Thomas on the morning of August 9th was a private named Eddie Calvert from Hamilton. He had joined the section 6 weeks earlier as a replacement. He had a habit of humming without sound, just the breath of a tune moving through his teeth whenever the shelling got heavy. Thomas had found this unbearable for the first week and had stopped noticing it by the second. On the morning of August 9th, Eddie was humming. They were moving through a field toward a German position on a low ridge when the machine gun opened from the left from an angle nobody had anticipated. Eddie Calvert stopped humming. He stopped moving. He stopped everything simultaneously and went down in the way that men go down when the damage is total and immediate. Without drama, without a last word, simply present and then not present. A fact changed in a fraction of a second with no ceremony whatsoever. Thomas hit the ground and crawled forward and did not look back. Looking back was not something the situation permitted. He reached the ridge with 4 other men. They cleared the position. Thomas sat behind the German parapet for 90 seconds, breathing. In those 90 seconds, he thought about Eddie Calvert humming with no sound. Then the order came to move again, and he stood up and moved. He did not think about Eddie Calvert again that day. This was not coldness. This was the only mechanism by which a man could continue to function, and continuing to function was the only thing the situation required. He thought instead about David Chen from Guelph, who had sat behind Thomas in school and who could do mathematics in his head faster than anyone Thomas had ever known. David had enlisted in September of 1916 with the cheerful certainty that the war would be over by Christmas. It was what everyone said. It was what everyone had been saying since 1914. David had been killed at Passchendaele in October of 1917, in mud so deep that men who fell into it drowned before anyone could reach them. In a battle that gained 5 miles and cost 250,000 Allied casualties. Thomas had received the letter in November. He had folded it and put it in his kit and had not spoken about it to anyone. David would never know what had happened at Amiens. David would never know that the thing they had come to France to do was finally, visibly, undeniably being done. Thomas found this thought almost unbearable and moved it to the back of his mind, where he kept the other unbearable things, and kept walking. On the evening of August 10th, Curry received an order that tested everything he had built. Field Marshal Haig wanted the offensive to continue at full pace along the same axis. Curry refused. Refusing a direct order from a field marshal in the middle of a successful offensive was the kind of decision that ended careers. Curry refused anyway. He told Haig that the ground ahead was thick with prepared German defenses, that pushing exhausted men into prepared defenses along a predictable axis was a method of consuming those men without achieving anything beyond the consumption. He had watched this logic applied at the Somme. He had watched it applied at Passchendaele. He was not going to apply it to his own corps. Haig looked at the numbers and agreed. The offensive paused on August 11th. Thomas did not know about this conversation. He knew only that the order to move did not come on August 11th, and that the absence of that order felt strange, the way silence feels strange after prolonged noise. Corporal Baines heated tea on a small fire and said he stopped it. Thomas asked who stopped what. Baines said Curry stopped the advance. Thomas asked how Baines knew. Baines said he did not know. He felt it. They drank their tea in the dark and said nothing else. What Thomas did not stop thinking about was the face of the German soldier from August 9th, the one with the expression of relief. He had been trying for 3 days to understand that expression. By the evening of August 11th, he understood it. The man had known for some time that it was over. He had simply needed the physical fact of the Canadians coming over the horizon to make the knowledge official. He had been waiting in his shell crater for someone to arrive and confirm what he already knew. Thomas found this the saddest thing he had encountered in 14 months of war, an army that had stopped believing in what it was dying for before it had stopped dying for it. He did not say this to Baines. He drank his tea and thought about Eddie Calvert, who had stopped humming that morning, and David Chen, who would never know that the machine had finally broken, and the German soldier who had lifted his hands with relief. And he concluded that war was a thing done to people by other people who were mostly not present for the doing of it, and that the men on both sides of the wire had more in common with each other than either of them had with the men who sent them there. He did not know what to do with this conclusion. He put it with the other unbearable things and went to sleep. The order to move came again 26 days later. He was ready. He was always ready. That was the one thing the war had given him that he had not had before, and the one thing he was not sure he wanted to keep.
There is a thing that happens to men who have been at war long enough. It is not what the recruitment posters warned about. It is not what the letters home described. It is something quieter and more permanent than any of those things. It is the moment when a man stops being surprised. Thomas reached that moment somewhere in the 53 days between the Drocourt-Quéant line and the Canal du Nord. Not in a single identifiable instant, but gradually, the way a man goes numb in cold water. First the extremities and then the center, until the cold is simply the condition of existence and not a sensation anymore. He noticed it one evening when a shell landed close enough to throw dirt across his face, and he did not flinch. The not flinching was not bravery and not habit. It was something more structural, a reorganization of the self so complete that the old self, the one who had counted nails in a hardware store in Guelph and written letters home every Sunday, was no longer the primary occupant of his body. Something else was. Something that could be given an objective and would reach it. He was not sure yet whether this was a gift or a damage. He would spend the next 40 years trying to determine that. The Hindenburg line was not a line. This was the first thing any man who fought through it understood. It was a system 30 kilometers deep, a layered architecture of trenches and concrete bunkers and pre-registered artillery and machine gun positions so dense and so interlocking that breaching one layer simply delivered you into the killing ground of the next. The Germans had built it with the confidence of engineers who believed they were constructing something genuinely impenetrable, the place where the Allied advance would finally stop, where the arithmetic of attack and defense would resolve permanently in the defender's favor. They were not wrong about the engineering. They were wrong about the Canadians. Curry looked at the maps for 3 days. He calculated the casualties required to breach each layer in sequence. He presented his commanders with a plan that had no heroics and no shortcuts. Then he went to his quarters and spent the night unable to sleep. Thomas did not know this. He knew only that the orders came and the advance continued, and that the ground beneath his boots had changed. It now felt deliberately hostile, ground that had been prepared for years specifically for the purpose of killing men who walked across it. Thomas walked across it anyway. So did everyone around him. This was the entirety of the plan at the level where Thomas operated, the level that actually decided the outcome. The Drocourt-Quéant line fell on September 2nd. 7 Canadians earned the Victoria Cross in a single day. This sounds like glory until you understand what earning a Victoria Cross in 1918 actually meant. It meant the situation had deteriorated to the point where one man, alone, under fire that should have been fatal, had done something beyond rational explanation, because the men around him were dying, and he had decided that was not acceptable. Thomas was not present for any of those 7 moments. He was present for the several hundred moments that earned nothing
and were recorded nowhere. The ordinary, sustained violence of men moving forward because the objective was on the other side of the fire and there was no other route to it. By evening, the line was breached. By the next morning, the Germans on the entire sector had begun withdrawing, because a line breached on one flank becomes untenable across its length. Thomas sat on the edge of a German trench that had taken 4 years to build and 48 hours to capture. He ate his rations. He thought about nothing. It was the closest thing to peace he had found in 15 months. Then came the Canal du Nord, and peace ended. The canal was 35 meters wide with vertical concrete walls. The Germans had positioned everything on the assumption that no army would attempt a frontal crossing in daylight. Curry's plan was to cross on a front narrow enough to saturate with artillery, push 4 battalions across simultaneously at 5:20 in the morning, fan out on the far bank before the Germans could respond, funnel the entire corps through a gap 2,500 meters wide. Thomas stood on the near bank at 5:19 in the dark, listening to 50,000 men breathing around him. He did not think about the plan. Thinking about the plan was not his function. His function was to move when the barrage opened. At 5:20, the guns fired and he went over the bank. What was on the other side was shell holes and wire so dense it had to be climbed, and machine gun positions and gas in the low ground, and German soldiers in every configuration, fighting and running and standing with their hands raised and their faces wearing the expression he had first seen on August 9th, the expression of men waiting to be told it was over. He moved through all of them. By the end of the day, the canal was behind the Canadians. 7,000 Germans were walking to the rear. Bourlon Wood was taken, and Thomas was still alive. He registered this as a fact without attaching any particular significance to it, because attaching significance to still being alive required imagining the alternative, and imagining the alternative was not something he permitted himself. What he remembered most about the Canal du Nord was not the crossing, it was what happened 2 hours after. The section was moving through a ruined village when Corporal Baines, who had been in France since 1915 and who had survived everything the war had built for him, stepped on a pressure mine in the doorway of a collapsed farmhouse. He was there, and then he was not there. No last words, no moment between them. The same total and instantaneous subtraction that had taken Eddie Calvert 6 weeks earlier. Thomas stopped walking for 3 seconds. Then he kept walking. He did not think about Baines for the rest of that day. He thought about him every day for the rest of his life, but he did not know this yet. And even if he had known it, the objective was still ahead, and the orders were to reach it, and he was a man who reached objectives. Cambrai fell on October 9th. The 2nd Canadian Division entered in darkness and found the Germans leaving, burning what they could not carry, retreating through streets lit by the buildings they had set alight. Thomas entered at dawn through smoke, past structures that were homes and churches, and were now frameworks inside which fire moved with a sound like breathing. He would learn years later in a library in Guelph that between August 22nd and October 11th, the Canadian Corps had sustained 30,800 casualties, nearly 1/3 of its strength. He sat with that number for a long time. He thought about Eddie Calvert humming without sound. He thought about Baines cleaning his rifle. He thought about David Chen, who would never know that the machine had finally broken. 30,800. He had not known while it was happening that the thing he was surviving had that number attached to it. He had known only the next objective and the men beside him and the specific quality of October light falling through smoke onto wet cobblestones in a burning city, and the silence of a section that had lost too many and not yet received replacements, a silence that had nothing to do with sound. He closed the library book and walked home through the rain and did not speak about it to anyone, which was what he always did, which was the one habit the war had given him that he had never found a way to put down.
On the morning of November 11th, 1918, at 10:58, 2 minutes before the guns stopped forever, A Canadian private named George Price stepped out from behind a wall in a Belgian village to check whether the road ahead was clear. A German sniper shot him through the chest. He was 25 years old. He died not knowing the war was over, because the war was not technically over for 2 more minutes, and 2 minutes is enough time for a man to be alive and then not alive. He was the last Commonwealth soldier killed in the First World War. Thomas did not know George Price. He did not learn his name until years later in a library in Guelph, but when he read it, he understood immediately. The thing that killed George Price at 10:58 was not a bullet, it was the training. The same training that said the objective is ahead and a man who stops moving is failing his unit. George Price had not been reckless. He had been doing exactly what all of them had been trained to do, and the training did not come with an off switch. 2 minutes before the end of the world was not enough time to find one. Thomas had been in Mons on the night of November 10th. The city had been under German occupation since 1914, 4 years and 3 months. The orders from above were that it was not to be shelled. The people inside had waited 4 years for this night and deserved their city returned in one piece. Thomas moved through streets he had never seen in complete darkness, clearing corners and doorways by feel. Somewhere in the second hour, a man in his section named Whitfield, 20 years old, was hit by machine gun fire in an alley 3 streets from the city center. He went down and did not get up. Thomas knelt beside him for 4 seconds in the dark and saw that there was nothing to be done. He stood up and kept moving, because the city was not yet clear and the objective was not yet reached. This was the war's final and most honest expression of its own nature, to keep killing for exactly as long as it was permitted to keep killing, not 1 second less. By dawn, the city was clear. Thomas stood in a street in the center of Mons, and what happened next was something he spent the rest of his life attempting to describe and never quite managing. The people came out with flags they had hidden for 4 years, Belgian flags kept inside walls and beneath floorboards at the risk of execution. They hung them from every window simultaneously. The street went from gray November stone to color in 30 seconds. People were weeping and reaching for the soldiers with both hands. An old woman pressed a loaf of bread into Thomas's arms and said something in French he did not understand. He did not need to understand it. Her face said everything that language could not. He stood holding the bread and felt something move through him that was not happiness and not relief and not pride, but contained all 3, and something else underneath them, a loosening of something that had been held rigid for 16 months, so sudden and so total that his legs felt unreliable. He sat down on the curb. A dog came and sat beside him. He put his hand on the dog and stayed there. At 11 in the morning, the guns stopped. Thomas had been listening to artillery every day for 16 months, at every distance, in every weather, at every hour of the night. It had long since stopped being a sound and become something more like a climate, a permanent condition of the atmosphere. When it stopped, it did not stop gradually, it stopped at once. 1 second, the world was the world he had lived in since June of 1917. The next second, it was a different world entirely. The difference between them was a silence so complete and so physical that it felt like pressure changing, like the earth had exhaled something it had been holding for 4 years. The men around him did not cheer, not immediately. They stood in the streets of Mons and looked at each other, and looked at the flags, and looked at the sky, which was gray and ordinary in November, and completely indifferent to the fact that the largest war in human history had just ended underneath it. Thomas sat on the curb in that silence and thought about Eddie Calvert, who had stopped humming in a field on August 9th. He thought about Baines, who had stepped into a doorway on September 27th and simply ceased. He thought about Whitfield in the alley 3 hours ago. He thought about David Chin, who had done mathematics in his head in a classroom in Guelph and who had died at Passchendaele before any of this was possible. He thought about all of them standing in this silence that they had made possible and that only some of them were standing in. Then the cheering started. The church bells began. The people of Mons filled the streets, and the soldiers around Thomas began to understand collectively and simultaneously that they were not going to die today, or tomorrow, or the day after that. Thomas did not cheer.
He sat on the curb with the dog and watched the celebration move through the street around him like weather, and he felt something he had not anticipated. For 16 months, his entire self had been organized around a single purpose: to survive long enough to reach the next objective. Every instinct, every habit, every mechanism of his body and mind, all of it calibrated for that purpose. The purpose was now gone, the objectives were gone, the war was gone, and Thomas Hillier, 22 years old, hardware store clerk from Guelph, Ontario, Onaton, sat on the curb in Belgium with a dog beside him and discovered that the self built for war does not automatically become a self built for peace simply because the war has ended, and that nobody in the cheering crowd around him had any information about how a man began that crossing. He would begin trying in the spring of 1919, when the ship docked at Halifax, and he walked down the gangway into a country that had not changed. He stood on the dock in the cold, harder air and tried to locate inside himself the person that had left 16 months earlier. He found the streets of Guelph. He found the smell of his mother's kitchen. He could not find the person those things belonged to. That person had gone over the parapet at 4:20 on the morning of August 8th and had not come back. What had come back was something harder and quieter and more durable, something that carried the weight of what it had seen without complaint, because complaining required explaining, and explaining required words that did not exist. He stood on the dock for a long time. Then he picked up his kit and walked toward the train. He did not look back at the ship. What he was leaving behind was not on the ship. It was in France and Belgium, in fields east of Amiens, and a doorway beside a canal, and an alley in Mons in the last dark hours of the last night of the war. And it would stay there, and he would carry it anyway. Which is how these things work, which is the one thing they never put on the recruitment posters, which is the one thing Thomas Hillier knew with complete certainty and could never find the right words to say.
He had survived the thing that killed 30,800 Canadians in 93 days. He did not know why, and not knowing why was its own kind of weight, permanent and without remedy. It was the first thing he thought about on his first morning back in Guelph when he stood behind the counter of his uncle's hardware store and counted nails into paper bags exactly as he had done at 17. The work was identical. His hands knew how to do it. Nothing about the action had changed, and he was a completely different person performing it. Nobody in the store could see this. That was the thing nobody had warned him about. The change was total and invisible simultaneously. He could stand in a room full of people who had known him his entire life and be, in every way that mattered, a stranger. And the strangeness was entirely internal, which made it not easier, but harder, because a visible wound has a name and a treatment and a timeline. What Thomas was carrying had none of those things. People asked him questions. They asked whether it had been bad. They asked whether he had seen much action. They asked whether he was glad to be home. Thomas answered with the economy of a man who understood that the truth was not what the question was actually requesting. What it was requesting was reassurance, a confirmation that the person who left had returned intact, that the war was a thing that had happened over there and was now finished. He provided this reassurance without bitterness. He said it had been rough at times. He said yes, quite a bit of action. He said he was very glad to be home. All true in the way that all incomplete statements are true, not lies so much as deliberate reductions, the vast majority of the information removed and the remainder offered as the whole. This was the arrangement he maintained for the rest of his life with almost everyone except Ruth. He married her in 1923. She was a school teacher from Elora. She had a quality Thomas recognized immediately and valued above everything else. She did not require him to explain himself. She did not ask what it had been like. She understood that the question and its answer lived somewhere she could not reach, and that the right response to this was not to stop trying to reach him, but to reach him by other routes, through the ordinary accumulated weight of a shared life, through the specific language of presence that requires no words and leaves no gaps. Thomas recognized this the first winter they were together and was grateful for it every day for 53 years. He told her so rarely and inadequately,
in ways she understood completely regardless, because she was that kind of person, and finding her was the one unambiguous piece of fortune in a life that had otherwise required him to locate his own reasons for everything. He walked the streets of Guelph in the early mornings before anyone else was awake. That was when the town was quiet enough to approximate the silence he was looking for, the silence that had existed for one perfect and terrible moment in Mons on November 11th, 1918, the silence that everything since had been measured against and found insufficient. In 1936, he went back to France with a group of veterans. On the third day, they went to Amiens. The bus left them on the road east of the city where the advance had started on the morning of August 8, 1918. Thomas walked a short distance into a wheat field and stood there alone. The wheat came to his waist. It moved in the August wind with a sound like breathing. The earth gave no indication of what had passed through it 18 years earlier. He thought about the silence at 4:19 and the guns opening at 4:20. He thought about Eddie Calvert humming without sound in the last seconds before he stopped forever. He thought about Baines stepping into a doorway beside a canal and simply ceasing to exist. He thought about David Chen doing mathematics in his head in a classroom in Guelph in a world that had ended before Amiens began. He thought about George Price stepping out from behind a wall at 10:58 on November 11th because the training said the objective was ahead and the training had no off switch. He thought about it all, and he understood, standing in that field, that what had happened here had been real in a way that almost nothing else in his life had ever been real, that the intensity of it had calibrated him permanently to a frequency that ordinary life could not match, and that this was not a complaint, only the central fact of who he was, the thing that had made him, the thing he had carried home, and the thing that would be with him until the end. He bent down and took a handful of the French soil. It was dry and warm and ordinary. He held it for a moment and let it fall back through his fingers. Then he turned and walked to the road where the others were waiting. A veteran from Winnipeg who had been at Amiens and who had not spoken for most of the trip put his hand briefly on Thomas's shoulder and said nothing and took it away. Thomas nodded. That was all. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the most complete conversation he had managed on the subject of the war since the day he came home. That evening in Amiens, someone told a joke and several of the men laughed. Thomas laughed with them. It was a real laugh, unguarded and genuine, the kind that arrives without announcement. Ruth read about it 3 weeks later in their kitchen in Guelph, in the letter Thomas had written on the train back to Paris. She noted that this was the first time he had described laughing in a letter from France. She understood without needing to be told what that meant. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer where she kept the things that mattered. Then she went back to marking her students' papers. Outside the kitchen window, the Ontario autumn was doing what it always did, turning the world gold and red, and then letting it go, the way everything eventually lets go, the way even the heaviest things eventually find their way back to the ground, though they leave something behind when they fall. They always leave something behind, and the ground remembers even when the men who carried them no longer can.